If you haven't read any of my books, they are a sort of quirky mix of sort of pop culture, science, maths, history, science fiction, romance, literature, everything, all sort of squunged into one sort of 100,000 word long novel. Eclectic, I think, is probably the word that most describes them. People who read my books and are very generous with my books in their praise, meet me and say that they were thought I would be insane because of the way in which the books leap around. And I assure them that I'm not insane. I'm actually quite normal and quite boring, actually. But what I've done is, as I always do with these, I thought, well, I can't just sort of stand there and talk about this. I better write it down, so at least that there's some sort of vague narrative thread to what I'm talking about. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read out what I was writing down yesterday and this morning on the train about sort of some various ideas, which hopefully, whilst probably full of the most egregious errors, may give you a demonstration of sort of perhaps where I'm coming from and whether there is room for a sort of well-meaning amateur in society. But interesting, I just found out my iPad, when it closed, was pressing the letter 4, number 4. So I have like 7,000 fours in the middle of my talk. But I won't actually, I won't say 4, 4, 4, 4, 4. I'll skip them when I get to it. Anyway, so here's the talk. Here's the talk. It doesn't last very long. It's probably about 10 minutes, although I can't do a word count, so I don't know. I thought I'd better start in this sort of formal way. Distinguished members of the society, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted, yet not a little surprised, to be speaking to you here this afternoon. Given that my formal education pretty much ended at age 16, and I launched myself upon the world with only a grade D in A-level art, the likelihood of having a book published, much less being invited to speak at the Royal Statistical Society, seemed on the face of it leptonic. The fact that I'm here now shows firstly that rare events do happen, and that secondly, you can achieve pretty much anything so long as one has the good fortune to be born into a favourable socio-economic group and possess a subconscious sense of entitlement, a good memory and imagination. But despite my obvious advantages in life, the fact that I'm here sans A-level, sans university, sans training, sans everything, seems to suggest there must have been an outside chance this encounter would ever happen, given that young Fforde's weekly highlights, circa 1980, consisted of the unreimagined Battlestar Galactica on Wednesday evenings and haunting the letterbox come Saturday for my weekly hit of that notable science fiction periodical 2000 AD. Since I rashly and clearly ironically named this title Expectation, Influence, Probability, and How I Discovered It, perhaps it might be relevant to understand how someone entirely self-educated stumbles and trips in the darkness over something that, ye gads, seems to have elicited more than its fair share of interest. At age 18, I was interested mostly in cars, going to the movies and dates. My father's profession as an economist seemed at the very least, bleakly inexplicable, and at worst, a thing of unparalleled tedium. As if to somehow accentuate the dullness of his profession, my father also demonstrated a quiet yet obsessive interest in early Christian art and a peculiar fondness for ecclesiastical architecture, especially anything with carved Romanesque doorways, particularly the Hereford School, of which notable examples still abound. That I was so unlike my father in every way seemed at the time a truth so abundantly obvious that I barely gave it a second thought. Economics? Ha! What possible interest could that be to anyone? And yet I find myself here, with not only an interest in economics and statistics, but showing the firm belief that without commerce, accounting, statistical analysis, and other pursuits condemned to appear boring by the unenlightened, most, if not all, of mankind's greatest achievements would never have occurred. It has been long pointed out that had not the mechanism of commerce not freed up Mozart, Turner, or Dickens from having to hunt for antelope or pick berries, then mankind truly would have been a lot duller. Writing was invented to facilitate accountancy, and double-entry bookkeeping ranks with the jet engine, compass, gunpowder, and radio of one of mankind's most important discoveries. It was always fascinating to me Not that Gaudi designed and built those unspeakably beautiful buildings in Barcelona, but that somewhere there must have been a committee that thought it was a good idea that he should. Wars are won and lost on the availability of credit more than any other factor. And Lindbergh flying the Atlantic was a remarkable achievement, but he only did it because mankind wanted him to, and there was some cash involved. So, how did I go from an unprepossessing youth with very little in or on his mind at all to be speaking here now? Where is the journey from one's favourite radio show of Sunday night chart rundown to More or Less, a show that I'm convinced is written entirely for me, and me alone? And is there, as I would always suggest, a place within intellectual discourse for an imaginative idiot who, while generally ignored, occasionally shows flash of insight? Someone who can think up ideas others do not, simply because they were never told what to think and arrived at their own conclusions by a circuitous route, but nevertheless, like Adam, got to name the animals in the Garden of Eden. I got here, if I got anywhere, by a pursuit I would recommend to anyone who realises quite late that they should have been paying more attention in class: sponging. And I don't mean that in the pejorative sense, but in the more bath time sort of sense. Absorb everything. TV, reading, movies, history, economics, current affairs, gossip, painting, architecture, the lot. Absorb it all and be a master of nothing. Retain much of it and enjoy it all. You can even skim the best bits off the top and enjoy it all the more. You can even give this froth of human experience a name: stuff. Stuff is hard to define. I don't mean things that we own or things we do, although it can, of course, be all those things. No, stuff is something else. It can be a fact, like desserts is stressed, spelled backwards, or a thing, like a knitted Hello Kitty Dalek. Yes, that's true, I have a knitted Hello Kitty Dalek. Or better still, an odd way of looking at something. At its very best, stuff is a twinkly, nebulous substance that is exciting, seems to possess a sense of mischievousness, and contains more questions than it answers. The Babel fish is good quality stuff, and so is Milo Minderminer's explanation of how he can buy eggs for 3 cents and sell them for 1 cent and still make a profit. Stuff is everywhere. Stuff enlightens, stuff entertains. Most of all, stuff inspires. I write about stuff, all kinds of stuff. Things that amuse me, things I can't help observing. I've done it for a very long time. If you're someone like me who enjoys quirkiness purely for its own sake, you will know that those personal collisions with stuff and the recognition thereof in one's formative years can and will guide you up into the most sunlit of pastures. I remember realising at a very young age that I had the above average number of legs. I realised at pretty much the same time that I was the only one who really found this to be amusing. Later on, I discovered my birth date was prime, that the chance of being in the fastest queue in a 10 checkout supermarket was actually pretty low, and that moonlight was an anagram of thin gloom. Along the way, I also discovered that you could remove Indiana Jones from Raiders of the Lost Ark and things would turn out pretty much the same, that the smallest bear's porridge could not possibly have been the coolest if they were poured at the same time, and that if T.S. Eliot had been S.T. Eliot, it would have spelled toilets backwards. And so began a long relationship with stuff, because stuff has a way of appreciating the subject, the substance of a subject, without troubling to know that well. In this way, I loved science, maths, and ultimately literature and philosophy without the 9 lifetimes needed to fully understand them. When my love of stuff leaked out of my head and onto paper, I found that stuff could be merged and reformed, intermingled, and otherwise be subverted into new and miraculous ways, ultimately leading to the curious merge of pop culture and science that appears within the pages of my books. Quite early on, I introduced the notion that current scientific thought as merely the newest in a whole series of boy bands that begun with Aristotle and then to Newton and Einstein, but that it would be arrogant to suppose that we would fall in love with that new boy band just as much as we had with the others, and that logically a new train of scientific thought, like a new boy band, is still awaiting us. I introduced the nextahedron, an irregular polyhedra that is unstable on all its faces. The ever-useful translating carbon paper, a Nextian number theory that not only permits the factorising of very large numbers to permit encoding of large books into a simple equation, Sleepy Hollow is 2 to the power of 216691 minus 1, but also a branch mathematics that permits one to start with the result, say 192, and work backwards to find the sum that created it, in this instance 3 times 64. An offshoot of that branch of maths also opens a gateway into being able to predict a precise cause simply by looking at the event, which would be very useful indeed, especially in murder inquiries. But it's not all mangling of maths. My theory of retro-deficit engineering is equally as sound, and states that we can and should use future technology now in the certain event it will be invented later on. Microchips won't actually be invented till 2034, but we need them now, so that's okay. Anyone who's ever overspent on their credit card will certainly know how this works. And Concorde was a valid demonstration that faster than sound air travel is actually not possible at all, so the technology was quietly withdrawn. An offshoot of this theory is the quantum duality of John Travolta movies, which I call the Schrödinger night fever principle, which states that solely by the weight of our expectations, a Travolta movie can be in 2 equal yet opposing states at the same time. Saturday Night Fever, for instance, is quite possibly the worst film you could see, but also one of the best, the same as Face Off and Pulp Fiction. The theory was incomplete, as Battlefield Earth is a stinker no matter how much you expect it to be good, and you'd have a hard time not enjoying Get Shorty. I like this idea, and hearing somewhere that the observer would always alter an event, either at the atomic level or when a documentary crew turns up or police start putting on riot gear, or giving too much lavish attention to a 5-year-old, I reasoned that why shouldn't something as large as the future be skewed by the weight of our expectations? I cite Blade Runner, a visionary piece of filmmaking directed, as you know, by Ridley Scott. Mobile phones aside, it does look surprisingly how the future might turn out to look. Night, rain, cosmopolitan crowds, faddy fashions, neon, dystopic hover cars, bit fascist. The people guiding how the future looks, the technologists, the designers, the fashionistas, all of us, in fact, now have an expectation the future will look like that, so as subtly and subconsciously nudging destiny in that direction. Without Maria from Fritz Lang's Metropolis, would there have been Honda's always lauded but somewhat dismaying attempts at robotics? Probably not. And this is pretty much where it ended up. Expectation influenced probability theory postulates that the observer can and will affect the outcome of events purely by the weight of their own expectations. That is to say that if humans expect or want something to happen, then it probably will. Here's an example. The Conservatives and Labour were recently arguing over the best way out of the recession. Was it austerity, as the Tories suggested, or increased spending, as Labour favoured? Since the recovery is not only beneficial but also expected, expectation influenced probability theory would suggest that both outcomes would lead to the same result. The theory of expectation influenced probability can be seen at work everywhere in history, when some unsurprising turn of events suddenly rears its head. The outbreak of the First World War, it is safe to say, an almost inevitable event where several parties could have done more to avert it, but chose not to. The second act of the European Civil War was almost as inevitable as the first. You would have thought that we'd have learned. As a curious aside, inverse expectation influence probability theory works in the opposite sense. Since some random bad events are unforeseeable and unknowable, if you begin every day thinking you might be killed by a lunatic and buried in a shallow grave on Raynham Marshes, then inverse expectation influence probability theory will ensure it doesn't happen. Because random events like this are impossible to predict. I spend most mornings running my mind through all the things that can't happen today because I've already thought they might. Struck by a meteorite, run over by a milk van, kicked to death by a donkey. It takes me an hour to run through the 793 things that I really don't want to happen, and as proof of my theory, not one of them has happened yet. But is any of this serious, or is it just a mashup of ideas, the free-flowing creativity from someone who has an interest in everything but is an expert in nothing? To me, expectation influence probability is something that seems pretty much self-evident. I give talks around the world and try to amuse my readers with pithy comments and witty asides. For the most part, gratifyingly, I succeed. After the talk, generous attendees suggest I should do stand-up comedy. I explain why I would be no good at it. The audience has arrived with the expectation of a good time. And with that in my favour, aside from setting fire to guinea pigs and firing them out of an air cannon live on stage, the self-chosen audience will be entertained. I think it's also why movie stars can survive several flops. The optimistic audience, waiting to be amused, are always very generous. and why public planning meetings, and often, all too sadly, that post-marriage relationships end up spiraling down into recrimination and despair, is simply because that's what society expects. Can any of this be quantified mathematically and used in any way that could possibly be beneficial? I have a feeling probably not, because expectation, influence probability, requires expectation to function, and that means expectation of the majority. We won't be able to realistically guard against a wholesale descent into a self-harming collective act of grand stupidity because we won't be able to see it. Our collective expectation influences our thinking and our actions. Dumb idea? Perhaps not. Returning to the recent recession, it seems on the face of it that such a crash was not only inevitable but long overdue. There are many experts now who claim they saw the crash coming, but only a few notable exceptions can easily prove their views. That a pyramid scheme of such enormity was allowed to rise to such dizzying heights was not only a graphic illustration of how expectation influence probability works, don't worry, everything will be fine, but also exposes its dark side. That we can so utterly convince ourselves everything is dandy right up into a complete and utter disaster does not bode well for our future. Not to be a harbinger of doom or anything, but I can't really see a frightfully happy ending to humans as a species unless we begin to adopt a more creative and imaginative response to our own shortcomings. And by response, I don't mean anything so mundane as an insightful, well-meaning review of our shortcomings and then bullet-pointing reasoned response, as that will achieve little. It's been well demonstrated over the years that the best ideas on the planet almost always falter horribly due to the law of unintended consequences, which state there is no idea too well-meaning, I cite the UN, universal healthcare, third world aid, the IMF, special relativity, that cannot stumble due to the burden of unintended consequences. My approach to dealing with difficult issues is to invent the law of invert the law of unintended consequences so that good can emerge from the unintended consequences of poor thought out or foolhardy ideas. I'm just going through all the fours now. Look at that. Clearly, since many ideas, I'll go there again actually because that's I like that idea about reverting the law of unintended consequences. Essentially what I'm saying, because I haven't written it down very well, is because you have really good ideas and then unintended consequences make it just turn into the worst idea imaginable. If you have a really bad idea, then the unintended consequences will ipso facto make it a good idea, right? It makes total sense to me. just so clear up that, because I think it's quite an interesting idea. Clearly, since many ideas already promulgated by government and society seem to fall into this category, I would suggest adding a sense of randomness to these new laws that will kickstart new and exciting and world-saving unintended consequences. For instance, I think that anyone who owns more than 60 acres should be compelled to employ an ornamental hermit with free provision of food and a grotto. That all verbs in the English language should be made irregular by decree, and that everyone should be made to spend a day, a month, engaging in a pastime to which they have absolutely no interest. Less randomly and more sensibly, anyone wanting to be in a position of power should be excluded from doing so, and politicians, generals and chief constables should instead be selected at birth, by lottery. Would this more random approach to the world's problems succeed? I have no idea, to be honest. But I can't help thinking that people like me might be able to contribute more to the dialogue. I can make odd connections that others can't because I was never told what I couldn't do. And perhaps there's an interesting possibility here for taking humans out of the deep pit of low creativity and imagination that we currently find ourselves. That every 20th intellectual be made to leave school at 16, not be allowed to attend university, and instead fed on pop culture, the Muppet Show, DVD box sets, an eclectic mix of reading and Radio 4, and then given a seat in the House of the Commons as the wild card. The free thinker who will look at things from the outside in our increasingly homogenized species. Well, it's an idea. In closing, I would like to share several other statistical anomalies that may require further examination by the august body. That the word sustainable has an 86% chance of appearing on the first 2 pages of any issue of The Guardian. Nuclear fusion is always a little under 30 years away. That's an interesting one. The Lib Dems, no matter what they do, rescue an infinite amount of puppies from a fire or be arrested for corruption, still have an unwavering slice of the vote, 19.8%. That there is a probability of 1, that there will always be at least one valuable car to be discovered in a barn somewhere on the planet. Quite like that one. And this is one that comes up a lot, I find, that the unknown Scrabble word the computer has just played, because I play, Scrabble against the computer, the one word that you cannot, you don't know what it is, has a 47% chance of being a type of foreign antelope. That's as far as I got. I hope that's, if not demonstrated, my complete misunderstanding of everything, but how I got to misunderstand things on a deeper level. I think that's probably the best way I can describe it, misunderstanding statistics on a very, very deep, fundamental level. But anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jasper. Some of you, like me, were seeing the echoes of some of Jasper's writings in the things he was talking about. And it makes me realise I'd missed all the other statistical aspects of your writing. It's quite curious. So there's a lot of things there which I hadn't actually spotted previously. Now, I think if it's all right with you, Jasper, at this point, we will have a panel at the end, but I'm sure there might be some questions if anyone wishes to ask. Does anyone wish to? What do you think the probability is, Jasper?
That someone's going to ask? I'll let you know after we've got a hand up or not.
I'm actually going to mention that the one person who gave me an explanation, like you, as why you came up with this was actually John. And I think it was really quite interesting. Basically, the oddball, the outsider, the unfettered brain would come up with something like this, when everyone else was conditioned and in straitjackets and working with blinkers. Well, I think it's quite an interesting thought. John was dead on.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody saw World War Z or World War Z, that zombie movie with whatever his name was, Angelina Jolie's husband, as I call him. It wasn't a very good movie, apart from the fact that the world was saved by Doctor Who in Wales, which I quite liked. But there was one interesting aspect of it, one tiny little interesting aspect that I liked, was that that a group of people had, it was called like the 10th man, and that you had one person who looked at a complete outside possibility, and this one person would be looking at something that no one else looked at, just in case. And that kind of idea appealed to me, and that was why how they could find out, the cause of this zombie apocalypse, was because there was one person who said, I think there could be a zombie apocalypse. And they go, okay, you're going to get some money to look at that, because that's what you want to look at. And I thought that was an interesting idea, that it might be worth, in the same way that, we say, okay, we're going to put all this money, because when everyone says, why are we accelerating, very, very small particles, at huge speeds in a circle? And someone says, because it invents the internet. And they go, oh, right, yeah, of course they do. That's right. I knew there was a reason. In the same way that one can spend huge sums of money because of the offshoots of this technology, it can be very beneficial. You could spend large amounts of money to somebody and say, right, go and look at some bizarre idea that you think is amusing, because it just might bear fruit, which is kind of a bit like the sort of unintended consequences, inverted unintended consequences. I think.
Okay. Any questions, guys?
Or observations. I'm here to learn. I got to fill books. I have small children that need to be fed, so I got to write books.
You didn't talk about the stupidity index, did you?
Oh yeah.
That does fit with your inverted law of unintended consequences as well. I'm just seeing that resonance coming through.
Yeah, stupidity index. I quite like the idea of a stupidity index. It was really trying to invert the notion, because we are always through these sort of through the media, taking the government to task for doing dumb things. And I started to think, because I write fiction, what if you had a political system, a government that didn't do anything wrong? And then in fact, that what governments did was essentially take the mass stupidity with which humankind is imbued and then drip feed it so it doesn't do us any huge amounts of harm. So how this sort of story thread progressed was that the government was doing so well at everything that in fact they actually had a huge stupidity surplus. And the problem was what to do with the stupidity surplus. And this then of course became how the opposition party could attack the the ruling party, who were called the Common Sense Party, that they had allowed the stupidity surplus to grow to such staggering heights
by not doing anything stupid.
By not doing anything stupid. So all of a sudden the Common Sense Party were in big trouble because they had to do something really, really dumb. And just burning 40,000 rubber tires in a pit in Cornwall wasn't enough. It wasn't stupid enough, and they would probably have to go indulge in a foreign war to get rid of the stupidity surplus. So it had a nice little circuitous sort of idea about it. But it also makes me think about things like we have average mental age of the planet questions in our house. We often throw these things backwards and forwards, and then when anything really, really stupid happens, we say things like, I think the human's mental age has just dropped from 14.3 years down to 13.9, and it'd be quite an interesting thing to do, is actually work out the world's mental age, because I'm not convinced it's very high. Sadly, not convinced it's very high. Some people have very high mental age, others don't. But but the stupidity index, I think, was good. I mean, maybe everyone should have a stupidity index. That you actually you sat down and someone interviews at length, like a sort of Voigt Kampf, sort of test, and decides how basically how stupid.
Then somebody would turn it into something that you could trade.
Yeah, I'm sure, and tax, actually. Yeah. Now, apparently Faraday, I don't know whether this is true or an apocryphal story, but Faraday was asked whether this new electricity he had discovered was going to be useful, and he said, "One day they shall tax it," which was very prescient, but probably not true, I should imagine. But,
we always call lotteries a tax on the stupid.
What, sorry?
Lotteries are a tax on the stupid.
Yes, yeah, I suppose they are, yeah.
Do you think the wild card only works if you've got the 9 out of 10, trained not to think outside any box at all, narrowed down and stodgy? Or could you have all 10?
As wild card.
Which is what businesses think is good. When they see people being inventive, they will have lots of those.
Well, I think people corporations like people to be inventive, but
not during working hours.
Yes, not too inventive. Often people say, well, I'm being very inventive and very creative, and I'm going to do such and such. And this happened with Apple quite recently. Is that people were like thinking outside the box, and they were pulled in because they were thinking clearly too far outside the box, and the company was now too big for that kind of thinking, or they weren't high up enough.
To bend the box,
or bend the box, something. I don't know. Another saying that I do enjoy, and I haven't been playing, which I will play with in a later box, is the reality distortion field, which I'm sure you guys would have heard of. And this is a wonderful, wonderful idea. Is that and it was Steve Jobs was known as this reality distortion field, used to actually move around with him. And if you fell into this reality distortion field, everything became a fantastic idea. And it was only like a couple of days later that you'd say, why are we doing this? This seems the most bizarre, strange thing. But it does happen. And I live in a place, this little town called Hay-on-Wye in Wales, and I always think there's a bit of a reality distortion field that exists around Hay, and that somewhere there is a sort of like an induction loop all the way around it, and that if sort of woe betide a farmer who would accidentally take a plough through the induction loop for the reality distortion field, that the field would suddenly falter and die, and we would be wondering why we are paying £7.50 for half a pound of Brussels sprouts, and disaster could ensue. And everyone in mid-Reiki or Reiki or whatever, be going, why am I doing this? I don't imagine. And they go, and then all the alarms would go off. The reality distortion field has been broken. So we have to, get the distortion field back up. But we say these things as jokes, or I say them as jokes. But there is a sort of nub of truth about reality distortion fields and stupidity indexes that seem kind of resonant.
Well, I think if there wasn't, it wouldn't be funny. I think it's the fact that we recognise these things. When you talk about the vast mass of stupidity and the need to build the shield to protect us from the attacks of the Almighty, which I read about on my Kindle yesterday on a train, was a very nice idea, but it's because we know that there is a huge amount of stupidity about, and we know that humans do extremely stupid things, as you mentioned, foreign wars, which, perhaps if you said foreign wars, we would all think, yes, well, that's just, what was it, Churchill said, too true to be good, and so it's not funny. But when you talk about this protecting us from the blows of the Almighty, we think that is funny because we no longer think Zeus is up there hurling down his thunderbolts to hit us, although sometimes I suspect that is true.
Yes, the anti-smokes defence shield. Yeah, I think that was based on sort of Star Wars, but it was basically they had to spend a huge amount of money to get rid of the stupidity surplus, and that was it. The anti-smoked shield to stop the an angry deity.
I was at a conference in the summer, and so there was a fantastic crack of thunder from outside, huge crash. Never heard one like it before. And I thought, Zeus is angry. And then I thought, firstly I thought, I'm in Italy, I should have thought Jupiter's angry. But I thought, where did that come from? It's amazing. Reading Homer is an impressionable learning problem.
Now guys, I'm afraid I think we're going to have to close it for now. So could I thank Jasper once more, and we'll move on and start looking at